Steiner's Theory of Knowledge Implicit in Goethe's World Conception. I would like to share some of the central features of this small work published by Steiner in 1886, when he was just 25 years old. He had been asked to collect and edit Goethe's scientific works for a massive publication of collected German literature, and this slim volume was prepared as a supplement to all his introductory essays on the different areas of Goethe's considerable range of scientific work. Amongst others, these include optics and a complete color theory, geology, botany and the idea of the archetypal plant, and comparative zoology in a new science Goethe called morphology. It was a great honor for the young man to be asked to complete such a task, and in the process Steiner came to recognize an approach in Goethe's methods that he believed did justice to natural phenomena in a radical way that opened up more holistic and fruitful insights. These, he shows, were based on a form of research that was strictly empirical and deeply intuitive. What I share here I offer as encouragement towards a study of the book in full. I will be quoting extensively from the book, and in the first part he looks at some preliminary questions. I will begin with this quote. A large part of the educated reading public of the present time will at once lay aside unread any literary scientific work which lays claim to be philosophical. Seldom, if ever, has philosophy enjoyed so little favor as at present. The educated man who is not a specialist has the vague feeling, these writings contain nothing suited to a person of my intellectual needs. What is here discussed does not concern me. It is in no way related to what I require for my mental satisfaction. Steiner goes on. Thus we possess a philosophical knowledge which no one is seeking, and suffer from a philosophical need which no one satisfies. End of the quote. He then describes how a range of eminent German thinkers, representing conflicting worldviews, all acclaim Goethe's work and find external agreement with their own perspective, but they conveniently ignore the width and totality of Goethe's worldview when it does not agree with theirs. For Steiner, Goethe's view of the world is the most many-sided imaginable. It proceeds from a central point which rests in the unified nature of the poet, and most importantly always brings to the fore that side which corresponds to the nature of the object. In contrast to this, Steiner asserts the following. The thinking of many men is effectual only in one definite way. It serves only for a certain type of objects. It is not unified, as was Goethe's, but uniform. There are men whose intellects are specially adapted to think out merely mechanical interdependencies and effects. They conceive the entire universe as a mechanism. Others have the impulse to take into consciousness everything, the secret, mystical element of the world. They become adherents to mysticism. All sorts of errors arise from the fact that such a particular way of thinking, entirely appropriate to one type of objects, is declared to be universal. If a thinker holding such a one-sided conception confronts Goethe's view, which is unlimited, because it always takes its manner of observation not from the mind of the observer, but from the nature of the thing observed, then it may easily be understood that this one-sided thinker lays hold upon the element of Goethe's thought which harmonizes with his own. End of quote. Steiner intends to develop an interpretation of Goethe's way of observing the world, which will lead to finding answers to the following questions. What is the significance of the reflection of the external world in human consciousness? What relationship exists between our thinking about objects of reality and these objects themselves? After these preliminary remarks, Steiner goes on to focus on human experience. I quote, Everyone is conscious of the fact that his thinking is kindled through collision with reality. We become aware of an external world of many very highly complicated parts, and we live in a more or less richly elaborated inner world. The first form in which all this meets us is already fixed. It is as if springing forth from an unknown beyond, that reality first appears to the grasp of our senses and our minds. We feel forthwith the need to penetrate by means of the classifying intellect into the unending multiplicity of forms, forces, colors, tones, etc., which appear to us. He goes on. Even thought itself appears to us at first as an item of experience. In the very act of examining our thought, we set it over against ourselves. We conceive its first form as coming from an unknown source. Everything which is to become an object of our knowledge must adapt itself to this form of setting itself before us. If we are to win in thinking a means for a deeper penetration into the world, then thought itself must become experience in this sense. We stand facing pure experience and seek within experience for that element which sheds light over itself and over the rest of experience. End of quote. Steiner now focuses on the content of pure experience. Let us now fix our attention upon pure experience. In what does this consist when it comes into our consciousness, not elaborated by our thinking? It is merely juxtaposition in space and succession in time, an aggregate of nothing but unrelated single entities. No one of the objects which there come and go has anything to do with any other. At this stage, the facts of which we become aware and which mingle with our inner life are absolutely without bearing one upon another. There the world is a multiplicity of things of uniform importance. No thing, no occurrence, can lay claim to any greater function in the fabric of the world than any other constituent in the realm of experience. If it is to become clear to us that this or that fact possesses greater significance than another, we must not merely observe things, but arrange them in thought relationships. At this stage of observation, the world appears to our minds as if an absolutely flat surface. No part of this surface rises above any other. None reveals to our minds any distinction as compared with others. These single entities must naturally be different from one another, otherwise they would not appear to us as an endless unrelated multiplicity. We do not refer to an undistinguishableness amongst the things perceived, but to the absolute want of meaning in the single facts of the senses for the totality of our image of reality. Not only are the things of the outer world and the processes of the inner world void of interrelationships at this stage of our knowledge, but even our own personality is an isolated unit in comparison with the rest of the world. We perceive ourselves as one of the numberless percepts without relationship into the objects which surround us. Only when the spark of thinking strikes the surface do there come to light elevations and depressions. One thing appears more or less lifted above the other. All takes on a certain sort of form. Lines run out from one form to another. The whole becomes a self-sufficient harmony. He goes on. If now we are to have a name for this first form in which we observe reality, we are convinced that the name most adequately applicable is to be found in the expression appearance to the senses. We here understand by the term sense not only the external senses, mediators of the external world, but all bodily and mental organs whatsoever, which have to do with our becoming aware of the immediate facts. Amid the unrelated chaos experience, and indeed at first as a fact of experience, we find an element that leads us out beyond this unrelatedness. This element is thought. Thought, as one of the facts of experience, assumes an exceptional position within experience. That which, as regards the rest of experience, must be brought from elsewhere, if indeed it is applicable at all, that is, into relationship according to law, is present as regards thought in its very first appearance. With respect to the rest of experience, that which enters as an appearance before my consciousness does not at once manifest the whole of reality. But with respect to thought, the whole thing passes over without residue into what is given to me. In the first case, I must penetrate the shell in order to reach the kernel. In the second, shell and kernel are an indivisible unity. Unlike other appearances, my thoughts are not experienced as riddles in need of explanation. It is only a universally human preconception if thought at first appears to us to be entirely analogous to the rest of experience. In the case of thought, we need only overcome this preconception within ourselves. In the case of the rest of experience, we need to resolve a difficulty inherent in the fact itself. That for which we seek in the case of the rest of experience has itself, in the case of thinking, become immediate experience. In the essay Nature, Goethe says that we are incapable of getting outside nature. If, then, we desire to interpret nature to ourselves in this sense, which was his, we must find the means within nature herself. A science of knowledge based on Goethe's world conception lays its chief emphasis on the principle of remaining always true to experience. No one has recognized this so fully as Goethe. The external stimuli that we must always presuppose in the case of an external object are not present in the case of thought. It is to these stimuli that we must ascribe the fact that sensible phenomena appear to us as something already existent. It is to them that we must ascribe the genesis of these phenomena. As regards a thought, I have the assurance that this genesis is not possible apart from my own activity. I must work through the thought, must recreate its content, must live through it even in its least details, if it is to have any significance for me whatever. Thus far we have arrived at the following truths. At the first stage of world contemplation, the whole of reality meets us as an unrelated aggregate. Thought is included within this chaos. If we move through this multiplicity, we find in it one constituent which possesses, even in this first form of its appearance, that character which the rest of the multiplicity must afterwards gain, that is, interconnected meaning. This constituent is thought. The essential character of thought can be derived from thought itself. If we want to arrive at the essential character of the rest of things, our point of departure in this inquiry must be thinking. Let us at once express the matter more clearly. Since we experience in thinking alone a real conformity to law, an ideal determinateness, therefore the conformity to law of the rest of the world must also lie included within thought. In other words, thought and the appearance for the senses are face to face in experience. The latter, however, gives us no disclosure of its own nature. The former gives us both as to itself and as to the nature of this appearance for the senses. At this point, Steiner raises a possible objection to the argument so far. It goes like this. It appears, however, as if we ourselves had here introduced the very subjective element we were so determined to exclude from our theory of knowledge. This objection rests upon a confusion of two things: the theatre in which our thoughts play their role, and that element from which they derive the determination of their content, the inner law of their nature. Subjectively, we merely provide the occasion through which the thought content unfolds according to its own nature. We grasp thought A and thought B and give them the opportunity to enter into a connection according to principle by bringing them into mutual interaction one with the other. It is not our subjective organization which determines this interrelation between A and B in a certain manner, but the content of A and B is the sole determinant. Our thought world is an entity resting wholly upon itself, a totality self-enclosed, complete, objective, and entire within itself. Here we perceive which of the two aspects of the thought world is the essential one, the objective aspect of its content, and not the subjective aspect of its mode of emergence. We admit that we are here faced by something which is difficult for us to judge with the capacities we possess. Yet we believe it can be mastered by every energetic thinker. We must form two different conceptions. First, that by our own activity we bring the ideal world to manifestation, and secondly, that at the same time what we by our activity call into existence rests upon its own objective laws. The way in which the thought content meets us is a guarantee to us that we have here the essential nature of the thing before us. Let us draw one step nearer to thought. Hitherto we have been considering the place of thought in relation to the rest of the world experience. We have reached the conclusion that it holds a unique position in that world, that it plays a central role. We shall for the present turn our attention elsewhere. We shall here restrict ourselves to a consideration of the inner nature of thinking. We shall investigate the very character of the thought world itself in order to perceive how one thought depends upon another, how thoughts are related to one another. From this inquiry we shall derive the means requisite for reaching a conclusion as to the question, what is cognition in general? Or, in other words, what is the meaning of forming thoughts about reality? What is the meaning of wishing to interpret the world by means of thinking? Here we must keep our minds free from any preconceived opinion. The concept is often defined as the mental counterpart of an object existing outside the mind. The concept is supposed to reproduce the object, mediating to us a true photograph of it. However, what thought exists for is not to merely repeat the sensible, which we have seen would convey in itself no essential meaning, but to penetrate into what is entirely concealed from the senses. Goethe always takes the path of experience in the strictest sense. As he describes in his essay, Experiment as Mediator between Subject and Object, he first takes the objects as they are, and while banishing entirely every subjective opinion, seeks to penetrate into their nature. He then creates the conditions under which the objects can appear in reciprocal action, and watches to see the results. He seeks to give nature the opportunity to bring her laws into operation under especially characteristic circumstances, which she brings about, an opportunity, as it were, to express her own laws. How does our thinking appear to us as experience when observed in itself? It is a multiplicity of thoughts which are woven and bound organically together in the most complicated fashion. But when we have once penetrated this multiplicity from all directions, it becomes again a unity, a harmony. All the elements are related one to another. They exist for one another. One modifies another, restricts it, etc. The moment our mind conceives two corresponding thoughts, it observes at once that these really flow together to form a unit. It finds everywhere the interrelated. This concept unites with that. A third illuminates or supports a fourth, and so on. If, for example, we find in our consciousness the concept organism, and we then scan our conceptual world, we meet with the concept systematic evolution, growth. It becomes clear that these two concepts belong together, that they represent merely two aspects of one and the same thing. But this is true of our entire thought system. All individual thoughts are parts of a great whole, which we call our conceptual world, a world not derived in essence from sense impressions. The concept triangle comprises all triangles. We do not attain it by merely observing all individual triangles. This concept always remains the same, however frequently I may conceive it, whereas it will scarcely ever happen that I shall see two identical triangles. It is quite incorrect to maintain that the content of the concept is borrowed from the external world, since it is evident that its content is not to be found in any sense phenomenon, which remains dumb until the spark of thinking. Thinking is an organ of man ordained to observe something higher than is afforded by the senses. To thinking is accessible that side of reality of which a mere sense being could never become aware. What thought exists for is not merely to repeat the sensible, but to penetrate into what is concealed by the senses. Our thinking is the interpreter that explains the dumb show of experience. All sciences should be permeated by the conviction that their content is solely a thought content, and that they see in the perceptual object a specialized form of the concept. This is expressed by Goethe in his essay, The Perceptive Power of Thought. Our theory of knowledge leads to the positive conclusion that thought is the essential nature of the world, and the individual human thinking is the only phenomenal form of this essential nature. Steiner now characterizes the essential differences between the inorganic and the organic sciences. To quote, "The simplest form of action in nature seems to us to be that in which an occurrence rests wholly from factors external to one another. The occurrence or relationship has been called forth merely by the fact that one thing which has occurred has in its occurrence produced a certain effect upon another thing, has transferred its own state to some other thing. The states of one thing appear as the results of those of another. The system of actions which happen in this fashion, so that one fact is always the result of others of similar sort, is called inorganic nature. Here, the course of an occurrence or the characteristic of a relationship depends upon external determinants. The facts bear marks in themselves which are the result of these determinants. In the sense world, as inorganic nature, nowhere does an individual whole appear. Nowhere is it brought to a conclusion. Every occurrence points to another upon which it depends, this to a third, etc. Where is there a conclusion in this? The sense world, as inorganic, does not arrive at individuality. Only in its totality is it complete in itself. In organic nature, this is not the case. Here we are studying individual wholes which becomes specialized through external circumstances. However, the specialized form itself must be derived from an inner principle. Here we are not concerned with purely external facts, which determine an outcome, but with some fundamental element that determines itself under external influences. But what is this fundamental element? It cannot be anything else than that which appears in the particular, in the form of the general. That basic element is, therefore, an organism of the general, a general form of the organism which includes within itself all particular forms. This general organism we shall call, after the precedent of Goethe, the type. This type is not elaborated in all its entirety in any single organism. Only our rationalizing thought is capable of grasping this by abstracting it as a general image out of the phenomenal. The type is thus the idea of the organism, the animality in the animal, the general plant in the specific plants. Under the term type, we must not imagine anything fixed. It has nothing to do with Agassiz called an incarnate, creative idea of God. The type is something completely fluidic, out of which can be derived all separate species and families, which we consider subtypes and specialized types. It is the inner aspect of that which we experience as the outer forms of living creatures. The Darwinian theory presupposes it. The type is the true primal organism, either primal plant or primal animal, according as it specializes ideally. It cannot be any sensible real entity. What Haeckel or other naturalists look upon as the primal form is a form already specialized, the simplest form of the type. The fact that it first appears in the time sequence in the simplest form does not render it necessary that the forms appearing later in time are the results of the chronologically preceding forms. All forms are the results of the type. The first and equally the last are manifestations of the type. It is the type that we must take as the basis for true organics, not simply undertaking to deduce a single species of animals and plants one from another. Like a red line does the type manifest itself through all the evolutionary stages in the organic world. Friedrich Fischer once expressed the opinion in regard to Darwinian theory that it would render necessary a revision of our concept of time. Here we have arrived at a point which makes manifest to us in what sense such a revision would have to occur. It would have to show that the deducing of the later from the earlier is no explanation in the organic sciences. That the first in time is not the first in principle. In organics, every derivation must be out of what constitutes the principle, and at most it would be necessary to show what factors are effective in bringing it about that one sort of entity involved in time before another. Natural law in inorganic science stands as something above this. The type flows into the single living entity, identifies itself with this. As mechanics is a system of natural laws, so organics must be a succession of forms evolved from the type. Only that in the former case we bring together the single laws and arrange them into a whole, whereas in organics we must cause the single forms to proceed in a living stream, one from another. Steiner then indicates that to understand the organic world, a completely different mode of thinking is required from that applied to the inorganic world. He goes on. Comprehending the type presupposes a more intensive activity of our minds. In reflecting about things inorganic, our sense perceptions provide us with the content. Here it is our sense perception which provides us with, in the case of the organic, we lay hold of only by means of our minds. The task which is required of our mind here is to participate productively in creating the contentual element while dealing with the formal. A mode of thinking in which the formal and the contentual appear in direct connection has always been called intuitive. The mind must work with far greater intensity in apprehending the type than in grasping the natural law. It must create the content with the form. It must take upon itself an activity which is the function of the senses in inorganic science, and which we call perception. The mind itself must be perceptive on this higher plane. It becomes clear, we believe, from our exposition, that Goethe's mind, just because it was fundamentally intuitive, found the right way in organics. The method proper to organics harmonized with the constitution of his mind. Our view of the world has led us to the point of view that the central essence of the world flows into our thinking, that we do not merely think concerning the nature of the world, but that thinking is an entrance into connection with the nature of reality. Insight gained by way of intuition is just as scientific as that won by proof. The concept appears as a principle, and within the sensible through the perceptive power of thought. The organics of Goethe is a comparative method, tracing the type back through all the phenomena in what we see evolving in a series of single beings. When moving into the realm of specifically human activities, Steiner sees a further step above the natural law determinism of inorganic phenomena. He says, for the spiritual or cultural sciences which arise out of human interaction, we are not dealing with the results of the natural laws of inorganic science, nor are we looking at a manifestation of a general type. What we experience is actions arising out of goal and intentions. In a general natural law, the particular is determined by the general. In the idea of humanity, the general is determined by the particular. And so to conclude, I will quote from his final chapter. Our theory of knowledge has rid cognition of the merely passive character often associated with it, and has conceived it as an activity of the human spirit. It is generally supposed that the content of knowledge is received from without. Indeed, it is supposed that we preserve the objectivity of knowledge in proportion as we refrain from adding anything of our own to the material taken hold of. Our discussion has shown that the true content of knowledge is never the material of which we become aware, but the idea conceived in the mind which leads us more deeply into the fabric of the world than does any analysis and observation of the external world as mere experience. The idea is the content of knowledge. In contrast to the percept passively received, knowledge is thus the productivity of the activity of the human mind. End of quote. Steiner connects this activity with the themes of optimism and pessimism, human freedom, and artistic creativity, and I recommend you read the book to explore his insights into these.